an Archaeologist. Ask an Archaeologist is a series of live stream interviews co-hosted by the Archaeological Research Facility and the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology at UC Berkeley. During each program, we hear from UC Berkeley affiliated archaeologists and answer audience questions. And you can submit your questions in the live chat box on YouTube. So today, I'm delighted to welcome to the show Mitch Allen, who's going to be talking to us about unfinished business, completing a long forgotten archaeology project in Afghanistan. Mitch is a research associate at the Archaeological Research Facility and at the Department of Anthropology at the Smithsonian Institution. He has a Ph.D. in archaeology from UCLA and taught that subject at 6 universities. Currently, he's writing up the results of a legacy survey project, the Helmand Sistan Project, Afghanistan, on which he was a junior archaeologist in the 1970s and is the subject of today's talk. In addition to his work in archaeology, Mitch spent 40 years in scholarly publishing, including the founding of 2 specialty archaeology publishers, AltaMira Press and Left Coast Press. So thank you for being here, Mitch, and welcome to the show.
Well, it's really a pleasure. I'm really enjoying these programs. I've seen some of them and they're really great. So thank you.
We're glad to hear that. Great. So yeah, feel free to start your slides and tell us about your fascinating project.
Okay, so everybody there?
Yep.
This is not me anymore, right?
It looks good.
Yeah, an old building. Well, most of the time when you hear about archaeology, you hear about the results of what people have found, all the really exciting, beautiful things, such as this really nice 15th century building. But there's a long process that's involved in getting there. And an even longer process in this case, since it's been almost 50 years since this field project has taken place, and it's now finally getting published and being made available. So I want to talk a little bit about the process of getting archaeology done as opposed to the products of archaeology. So here we are finishing this unfinished business. Of course, no one does an archaeological project by themselves, and I wasn't even in charge of this one. I was just a junior archaeologist, as Sarah said, but we have many people to thank for the ability to get this far and to get this thing published. I won't list them all, but here's a few of them. When I was 23 years old and a first-year graduate student at the University of Michigan, one of my professors said, well, I know a guy who was looking for somebody to go with him to Afghanistan. Anybody interested? And of course, being a first-year graduate student and looking for a project to get my graduate career started, I raised my hand, and sure enough, next fall, I was off in southwest Afghanistan with Bill Trousdale, the fellow in the hat there in the center, working on the Helmand Sistan Project. And I worked with him for 2 seasons, and then life intervened, and I didn't go back and ended up getting a job in scholarly publishing and spent 40 years there. In the meantime, Bill had continued to work in Sistan for every year from the time on in the mid-70s when I joined him till the end of the 70s, and then went on to finish his career working on a variety of other projects. In addition to being a specialist on the archaeology of Afghanistan, he also spent a lot of time studying European explorers, travelers, military who went through Central Asia and Afghanistan. He was a specialist in military schools, he was a specialist in Chinese art, and finally retired in the mid-1990s and moved to Pasadena. Part of what happened to the Sistan project, it never did get published, which is surprising since we ended in the late 70s when the Soviets came in and invaded Afghanistan. But he kept hoping, as many archaeologists do, well, we still have to go back one more time to look at the site one more time. And so it never really got together to getting published. And of course, over the last 40 years, as everyone knows, Afghanistan has not been a place where archaeology has been very easy to do, particularly Southwest Afghanistan, where we did our work. So when I retired in 2016, I contacted Bill and said, well, maybe I can help you get this thing done since it's been sitting there for a very long time. And so for the last 3 or 4 years, that's what I've been doing, and working with Bill, who's still alive and kicking and living in Pasadena. He's hit his 90th birthday a month ago. And so he and I are still trying to get this thing finished. This is not a new thing in archaeology. There's lots of projects that have sort of started and never gotten finished, or gotten finished many years later. For example, one project here at Berkeley, the Tel El Nazbet project in Israel, was done in the 1920s and 1930s, but it wasn't really published until a graduate student at Berkeley, Jeff Zorn, came by and took all the notes that they had that are now sitting in the Bidet Museum, which is right off the Berkeley campus, and turned it into his dissertation. There have been a bunch of other projects like that. I've been involved in one of them, like the Archaeology of Nazca, Peru, as a publisher. But this is now more and more what archaeologists are doing, partly because it's much harder getting out into the field. It's much more expensive. It's very hard to do. While it used to be, foreign missions used to be very welcome in other countries, they're much less so as they develop their own archaeological capabilities. So looking at old stuff that's sitting in archaeological collections and museums, like ARF, for example, is much more popular these days than it was. So let me tell you a bit about the Helmand Sistan Project. It was a joint project between the US government and the Afghan Institute of Archaeology, the Smithsonian, and we covered the entire southwest corner of the country of Afghanistan, probably 40,000 square miles. And it was a survey and excavation project just to try to find out what was there. There had been a few people who'd done some short projects there, but we were there for a decade, which is a pretty long time, and we gathered a lot of stuff there while we were there. Fortunately, of those 40,000 square miles, most of it was desert, and there wasn't really a lot to be found. But the Helmand River, which is the largest river in Afghanistan, shown here, runs right through the middle of it, and we spend most of our time looking for archaeological sites in the Helmand Valley. And in fact, we came up with almost 200 archaeological sites, of which we excavated 15. And so there's a lot of work there to talk about, a lot of things to do in order to be able to get this material published. We also established the first archaeological chronology, who lived there and when, how do we define the different periods of time. I won't go into that into great detail. There's other places where if you want to get that, I can tell you how. But there are some things that we found that are really important for archaeologists, and some that are actually important for people who are not archaeologists. For example, all previous archaeologists, both in Afghanistan and in Iran across the border and Pakistan across the border, thought this place was deserted for 1,000 years between about 1800 BC and 600 BC. And lo and behold, we found a culture that dates to that time. We dated with carbon dating and a variety of other methods that fits just in that time period. So we can tell people now that no, this place was not empty for 1,000 years. Buddhism, the expansion of Buddhism, of interest to people interested in its history. Most Buddhists went east toward China and Japan and places like that, but some of them went west, and we have found what is now the westernmost Buddhist shrine in the Helmand Valley, sitting on top of a mountain, a place called Hanagohar. Zoroaster, Zarathustra, the founder of Zoroastrianism, came from this particular area, this area called Sistan. And we found several Zoroastrian fire temples that go back to very early in the history of this religion that sort of help explain how it grew and how it developed and what the worship of Zoroastrianism was like back in those days. Probably the most impressive archaeological site was this city called Shari-Gogala, which was in a huge fortress that was built what is now in the middle of the desert, but then was a highly irrigated plain with a large population. But it was the fortress of the Safarid kings of the 9th and 10th century, Islamic kings that were actually a dynasty that were based here. And they built this giant fortress that is, that's about 25 meters high. It's surrounded by 5 walls and 3 moats. And it is still sitting there. Those buildings that you see on top there date to the 9th and 10th century. So they're 1,000 years old. They're still sitting there 2 and 3 stories high.
If I could just ask a quick question here. Do you know anything about the current state of these sites? I mean, what is something being done to protect them, or are they being monitored in some way?
It's a really good question. We don't really know. There has been a lot of U.S. military in parts of this area because this is one of the hotspots when the U.S. was fighting the Taliban, but not so much this particular area. This is an area called Sarotar, which is out in the middle of the desert. It wasn't always desert. Like I said, it was irrigated and was heavily populated, but there's no people out there. So there's nobody to fight. And there's always been looting going on in these sites, but for the most part, even after 10 seasons of excavation there, we didn't find vast gold hoards of gold or giant Roman sculpture or Greek sculptures or Islamic piles of Islamic jewelry and stuff like that. So there's not a lot there. Every year the locals go out there and look on the ground after the rains, and they find things and bring them and sell them in the market. But the reason for tearing these places apart isn't really there. There's not a lot to be found. So fortunately, it's been saved. And because of the fact it's out in the middle of the desert and you have to bring your own food and water to get out there, no one's going to spend a long time out there. Mm-hmm. Another historical fallacy was when the Mongols came through, the Tamerlane is said to have destroyed this entire area and left it uninhabited for decades afterwards. On the other hand, when we got there, we found this huge collection of these large estates, these large buildings, again, some of them 2 and 3 stories high, that are still sitting out there in the desert that date just to this time. So the historians got it wrong, or the historians were misled as to what actually happened. But we know that there were a lot of people living here at that time, which wasn't expected. And of course, like every other archaeological project, we found all kinds of interesting things. Figurines, architectural elements, inscriptions, and because it's such a dry desert, we found organic materials like cloth and rugs and wooden tools and so on and so forth. Anyway, but that's what we found, and that's sort of what most people want to know when you ask archaeology. But when I make these presentations, what does that all mean? How did we actually get? Oh, well. Of equal interest is we found stuff that's probably of more contemporary interest as well. I've said now a couple of times that this area was highly irrigated. Well, there were canals that went out there. And as you can see, my colleague there, John Whitney, the geologist of our project, is standing at the bottom of one of those canals, which must have been, 4 or 5 meters high and very wide, that brought water all the way out to the desert, an area that's complete desert now and covered with sand dunes. So how do they manage to avoid the sand dunes? How do they manage to irrigate this land? How do they manage to put a population there where there's none now? And those kinds of things are kinds of questions that we are asking that have not only of interest to archaeologists and specialists, but to interest to people who want to rebuild not only this desert, but other deserts as well. So there's a lot of contemporary interest, particularly in an area of climate change, an era of climate change, of how people can survive in what are marginal climates. The sand dunes themselves are pretty impressive, and so I'll show you later, they kind of move back and forth. So we left in 1979, and had been saying that the place had never been touched by archaeologists since then because of 40 years of warfare. Well, it turns out that I lied. There was because of all the archaeologists there, one of the military who had been brought there, an anthropologist who had been brought there to work with the military, was an archaeologist who happened to be a specialist in Central America, but he asked his commanding officer, could he go up and down the Helmand Valley a bit and see what these archaeological sites were like. And in fact, Mark Abramiuk, who lives here in California and a practicing archaeologist, did in fact do some work in about a decade ago and found a bunch of archaeological sites that we hadn't found and nobody else had found as well. So the archaeologists, you can't keep them down. You know, you put them out in a desert somewhere and surround them with a military encampment, and they take some Marines out and go and look for archaeological sites.
Now, did he have a map of previous surveys to know where the existing sites were, or are these new sites that he just documented?
No, he got dropped near Lashkargah, which is the city at one end of the Helmand Valley from where we started. And he just saw these mounds up and knew that they were archaeological sites, convinced his commanding officer to go out there, and spent most of his time after he got back trying to figure out what these places were. Some of the sites we had in fact found, and other archaeologists who had been down the Helmand Valley had found, and we was able to compare what he has with what we had found 3 or 4 decades earlier, or in some cases longer. But some of them were sites that we hadn't documented. So we're very appreciative of Mark and the work that he did. And he and I are in contact trying to make sure his stuff gets published as well as our stuff.
That's great.
So here we are with an archaeology project that is 40 years old. And I met with Bill and said, let's get the band back together and get this thing published. Some of the band was not findable. They were deceased, unfortunately. John Whitney, our geologist, had just finished and retired from her career at the U.S. Geological Survey. But we found some of them and were able to pull together more material than what we had at Bill's, which is where most of the stuff was. But finding the material was the first problem. Bill, when he retired, he was a Smithsonian curator, and his wife was a professor and a Shakespeare scholar at the University of Maryland. And they packed all their stuff into hundreds of boxes and shipped it out to California, where it sat in a garage for decades. And where was all the stuff from Sistan? Well, my first project was to excavate Bill's garage. And that took several field seasons itself, as I went through hundreds of boxes looking for slides, field notebooks, photographs, objects, you name it. And we've only found about 80% of it. And there's still a bunch of boxes in the garage we haven't been able to go through. But we have most of the material, and therefore we're able to move along on getting the project published.
So can I just walk back to sort of the field for a sec? When you were in the field doing this survey, you were collecting objects from the ground, right? And obviously taking photos and taking notes. Can you tell us a little bit about the amount of stuff and how that process worked? You would bag things up, and then did they all just get shipped to him, or did they go to different places?
No, but as is common in most projects that take place outside the United States, if you were a U.S. archaeologist, you can't just pack things up and take them home. Mm-hmm. They belong to the country where they were found. And in fact, we had turned over a bunch of material to the Afghan government. It was located, and they were put in the Kabul Museum. And there was other stuff that we had not yet processed. You photograph objects, you draw pictures of them, you take field notes on them, and those were actually left at the U.S. foreign aid base in Lashkargah. When the Soviets came in, most of it was either in Lashkargah or Kabul. But there were a couple of trunks of material that were at in the base of the USIA office in Kabul that Bill was planning on coming back and working on when he came back in 1980. And he got an emergency call from Kabul saying, I've got these things in the basement. The Soviets are at our door. What do you want us to do? And so for lack of another option, he asked them to be shipped to the Smithsonian, where they had been for the last 40 years. And I have more of a story about those in a minute. But most of the stuff was left in Afghanistan. And so the part of the finding everything is, well, what happened to our objects? So as everyone probably knows, during the wars, the Kabul Museum was absolutely destroyed. Gunfire, mortar shells, and so on and so forth. Their warehouses were looted. Probably a lot of our stuff is still there, piled on the floor with other things from other research projects. But sorting that out is going to take decades. There's a team from the University of Chicago helping the Institute of Archaeology in Afghanistan trying to sort it out now. And they're making some progress, but I've not yet heard anything about whether or not they were able to find our stuff or not. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, the stuff in Lashkargah at the USAID base, I have some friends who had worked for the State Department who had been through Lashkargah, since a lot of U.S. military and U.S. state people had been through there, because it was one of the main U.S. bases were surrounding it. And I told her where we had left it. And she said, well, the Soviets were pretty suspicious when they got to the U.S. bases. They thought they'd be booby-trapped, so they put dynamite in and blew them up. So it's possible that the pieces of broken dishes that we left there 50 years ago are still there, but they're much smaller pieces now if they were left there. I haven't been able to get anybody who actually is still in Lashkargah to be able to look for them. But they may still be there for all we know. And then, of course, there's a very small percentage of stuff that's located at the Smithsonian. I'll mention that in a minute.
Thanks.
Among the other things we found was a manuscript written by Ghulam Rahman Amiri, who was the Afghan Institute of Archaeology archaeologist who was with us since it was a joint U.S. and Afghan project. In addition to all his work with us as an archaeologist, he also conducted an ethnography of the villagers in the villages that we worked in and people who worked with us out in the desert, and wrote this wonderful piece of, full-length book about the people who lived in these villages, which was written in Dari, which is the lingua franca of Afghanistan. It was translated in English in the 1980s and then got buried in one of these boxes and was never published. So the first major project that is going to get published out of the Helmand Sistan Project is going to be an ethnography of the Baluch people of Southwest Afghanistan, written by Ghulam Rahman Amiri, which is important, one, because the culture of those people is now gone after 40 years of warfare, and two, that Mr. Amiri is one of the few people who was an Afghan who was writing ethnography of Afghanistan in the 1970s. Most of that work was being done by Westerners and not by Afghans. So this was one of the unique pieces that we managed to find, and finally we're now getting it published. But there was one problem. We had lost track of Mr. Amiri. We had last heard that he'd been in Afghanistan when the Soviets came through. Because he was a leftist, he actually welcomed them and was made the Minister of Tourism of the country. But then he fell on the wrong side of someone and was thrown in jail, later fled to New Delhi. And in the 1990s or so, we had lost track of him. So part of my excavating was excavating what happened to Mr. Amiri. Sadly, Mr. Amiri passed away about 15 years ago from ALS in Denmark. And how do I know that? Well, in finding him, there was no record of someone by his name in all the Google searches I was doing. But eventually, I found this woman named Giti Amiri, who was a young 30-year-old Muslim woman of Afghan descent living in Copenhagen, and who was a public figure and still is a public figure in Denmark. She is a blogger. She has written her autobiography. There's a copy of her book right here. She is on media regularly advocating for women's rights and for Muslim rights in Denmark, where there are the same kind of immigrant fears that we have here in the United States. Anyway, in reading things about Giti, I found that she mentioned her father was an archaeologist. Well, what are the odds, right? So as I found more and more things, of course, I'm doing all this in Google Translate in Danish, since I don't read Danish. But sure enough, it turns out at one point she finally mentions her father was Ghulam Rahman Amiri. So I write her an email and get an answer back from her almost immediately, and get an answer even quicker back from her brother, who's over here on the left, Bob Rock, who's the oldest of the 10 children of Mr. Amiri, and who happens to be living in Portland, Oregon, who I've now met and has now become a full partner in this project in getting his father's book published. So we're thrilled to be able to publish this, and it'll be out in about 6 months from a publisher called Bergan.
That is fabulous. What a great story.
Yeah,
we will be sure to include a link to that in your video here when it comes out.
Yes, actually, I think the link is right there.
Yeah, okay, great. Then we'll put the link down in the description of the video so users can easily find it.
Anyway, all of the stuff from Bill's garage is now in my garage, but at least they're now labeled and they're ready to go back to the Smithsonian to be put in the National Anthropological Archive when we finish working on the project. But the other thing we did was digitize everything. Remember, this was the 1970s when things weren't done on computers. And so we have now digitized about 25,000 pages of photographs, slides, maps, field notebooks, and so on and so forth. And so these are all available and will be available again from the archive, the National Anthropological Archive, for any other scholar who wants to look at this material and work with it. So I've already answered what happened to our artifacts. That was going to come along a little later. But what happened to the two trunks that ended up in the Smithsonian? Well, Bill said, well, they got put in the attic of the Smithsonian. So I called my friend at the Smithsonian and say, what's in your attic? And it turns out, well, there was things in the attic, but it was also full of asbestos and rats. And so the things had been moved out of the attic and moved out to the Museum Support Center, which is in Washington, right up across the river from where the museums are. But she had no record of anything from our project. Well, that made sense because it had never been actually acquired by the Smithsonian. The stuff was still belonged to Afghanistan, so it was being held by them, but it was never acquired by them. And a phone call to the guy who actually worked out in the Museum Support Center produced the fact that, oh yeah, these things are all out here. And so we were able to find all the material, and we are now still in the process. If I can ever get back to Washington after the the quarantines end in documenting them, photographing, drawing them, writing up field notes, and then returning them back to Afghanistan. Of course, the warehouse in the Smithsonian has many other really interesting things as well, including, boar's heads that were shot by Teddy Roosevelt. A similar thing happened to the coins. They were given to the Smithsonian Coin Department, and they've been lost there. We haven't got those back. The drawings were put in somebody's office, and they found them 25 years after Bill had retired, sitting in the same drawer where they were left 25 years earlier. Since we're running out of time, I'll leave the story of this other collection of that we had found that were shown to us by a looter, and that again had gotten lost. That in turn, I had tried to find that and found out that had actually been kept in Afghanistan, except a few pieces that this looter had managed to take out. And we're now in the basement of a museum in the United States in Utah. And I found that one of our photographs here on the right matches one of the photographs in the museum, a contemporary photograph of the museum. But I won't have the time to do that. There have been a lot of people who've helped us, scholars from other, when you do a survey, you find things from, in our case, 5,000 years and 40,000 square miles and bunches of cultures, and no one can be an expert on all of this. So we had help from a lot of other people, including and significantly the Camel Project at the University of Chicago, where they're helping the Afghan government try to locate every archaeological site in the country. And here we have all these notes of all these places we've seen. They see what it looks like in the air, and we can tell them, oh, this is what it looks like on the ground. And so between us and the Camel Project, we've been managed to help document what Southwest Afghanistan looked like over the course of the 5,000 years. I found comparative material from other researchers who've been there. Some of our friends have helped, other archaeologists who live in Washington who helped me with this kind of work. And we've even had parties with some of these objects where we've collectively documented them, me bringing in friends who have come on over to help photograph and to help draw these various sherds that we have. Of course, the goal of all this is to get the material published. The volume is about half written. I'm hoping to have it done within the year. We've already presented several pieces, including one at Berkeley, as you know, Sarah, that's on the Berkeley YouTube site, and I'll have a link at the end of this. And of course, as I mentioned, documenting this through the archives, and then importantly, repatriating the objects that are now in the Smithsonian back to Afghanistan where they belong. And the Afghan government's been nice enough to allow us to keep them, even though they know they're now in Washington and want them back. But they've allowed us to keep them until we finish our documentation and writing up the project before we do so. In any case, there are other places that you can look for this, for material on this project. The Berkeley YouTube channel I gave a talk there a year or two ago. I've also talked there on how to publish archaeology. And then our Helmand Sistan Project has a website that's still in development right now, but that's going to be the link. And of course, I do my own blog called Scholarly Roadkill, which talks about this project a lot. So if you want to find out more, it's there as well. Anyway, that's the presentation I had. If you have any other questions or thoughts from people, I would be welcome to answer any more.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And again, for the people watching this, we will copy those down into the description of the video so you can easily click on them and find those other related materials online. So Mitch, could you just explain again how long you've been doing this sleuthing? I don't know how you could do that work and also have a full-time job running an academic press. It seems like a lot of work.
Well, I didn't really start working full-time on this until after I retired. The publisher that I had was sold off to a large publisher about 4 years ago. And so I've been working on this project more or less since then.
That's an impressive amount of work, though, in 4 years. I mean, this is really incredible what you've pulled together. Yeah, congratulations. We have a comment from someone watching who said that they've seen mislabeled material in vitrines in the, quote, Oriental Museum in Rome from Italian adventurers in this region. And then they also followed up asking you do you know if the Musée Guimet, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, still has active projects in the area. Their display arrangements of Buddhist material from the area had a big head start.
Well, let's take the second question first. From the 1920s to the 1960s, no one was allowed to do archaeology in Afghanistan except the French. So they had a big head start because no one was allowed there for 40 years until the Afghans finally realized that if they allowed other missions in, missions usually were involved with the broader relationship between Afghanistan and those other countries. So they would welcome the archaeological missions as part of other kinds of things, joint projects they were doing with these other countries. But yes, the French had an enormous lead. There is a institute called DAFA, Délégation Archéologique Française en Afghanistan. Pardon my poor pronunciation of French, but they are still very much active and are still conducting archaeological projects in Afghanistan. And the material there is, they have a very large collection of things. A lot of it is in the Musée Guimet. In fact, some of the photographs we have found of the French who went through Sistan in the 1930s, we've managed to get from the Musée Guimet. Labeling archaeological objects correctly is not a science. Archaeologists do the best they can when they're in the field, but the whole idea of this whole endeavor is that our knowledge always increases. Every new project, every new research, every new find gives us a better sense of what it is that archaeologists know and what we don't know. So when you put something in a museum, you put a label on it and it says, this is what this is. And it may be that 5 years or 10 years or 50 years later, we know much better about what those objects are and the label's incorrect. It's the wrong thing. And over time, museums will get around to changing the labels, but it doesn't happen in real time. When an archaeologist publishes a new article saying, well, I think that actually these particular sculptures date from this particular time and not that particular time, it takes a while for the museum world to catch up. So it's not surprising that you'd find wrong labels on a museum exhibit, but museum people are also very committed to knowledge and to getting it right. So sooner or later, those things do get corrected.
Well, and I guess the mislabeled things.
People don't always agree as to what something is or what it belongs.
Right, and that's a good argument for perhaps having more materials online so people could have these discussions more broadly and perhaps make updates more quickly.
Yes,
but
absolutely.
It's also something that's interesting because, like you say, they're in the context of when they were collected and how they were described. That's also a study in and of itself of the sort of history of these objects and the context in which they were described.
Yeah, the first serious work on Sistan was done by the British Boundary Commission that was trying to establish the boundary between Afghanistan and Iran. And one of them was a surveyor who worked for the Survey of India, who was fascinated with archaeology. He was not trained as an archaeologist. This goes back to 1903. And most of probably the most significant amount of work done on this area before we went there was done by this guy, G.P. Tate. And again, he did the best he knew with what archaeologists knew about Afghanistan in 1903, which was very little. But the raw material that he has been used by everybody ever since then, including us.
Interesting. Well,
he also has photographs of some of the places that he saw that we went back and saw 75 years later, and we can compare the photograph of what it looked like when he saw it and when we saw it.
That's amazing. We're just about out of time. There's one more question. Just, I don't know if you'll know about this, but they're asking if the talks from the Kabul curators that happened a few years ago, if they were recorded.
I do not know that. I can't help you. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Maybe something else to come across in your sleuth work.
Yeah, there's my next sleuthing job, finding what the Kabul curators had to say. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us today, Mitch, and for telling us about this amazing work. We'll be looking forward to seeing it as the publications come out and learning more about the results.
Well, thank you, Sarah. It's really been a pleasure.
And thank you to everyone who listened today and for sending in your questions. We have another Ask an Archaeologist talk occurring tomorrow at the same time at noon, and it's called Myths About the Ancient Maya with Esteban Miron Maravan. So we hope to see you there. And if you have an opportunity to click on the feedback form below the video, we always appreciate hearing feedback and suggestions for how we can improve this show. So thank you very much, everybody. Thanks, Mitch.